Elias Ward had lived alone for so many years that silence had become a part of him. His small wooden house sat on the edge of a wide valley, far from town, surrounded by open fields where the wind moved like a gentle river. People in town often called him the quiet cowboy because he rarely spoke unless he needed to. He worked with his horses, fixed his fences, and watched the sun rise and set without anyone beside him. He never complained about loneliness. He simply lived the life that fate had given him. Still, there were nights when the empty chair across the table felt heavier than usual, and he wondered if life would always remain this way. The town nearby had people who liked to joke, sometimes cruelly. They were not bad in every way, but they often forgot that their words and actions could hurt others. One day, news spread that a small group of travelers had arrived, offering introductions and arranged marriages for people who wanted new beginnings. Among the travelers was a woman named Mara. She was quiet, gentle, and carried a sadness she tried to hide. Her previous community had labeled her as infertile, a word that had followed her like a shadow. She had been told again and again that she would never have a family, never hold a child, never be chosen with love. Each time someone repeated it, the edges of her heart weakened a little more when the townsfolk learned about her. Instead of helping her with kindness, they laughed. Some of them whispered that she should be sent to Elias. "He won't say anything," they joked. "He'll just take whoever is brought to him. He's too quiet to refuse." They shrugged off the idea as harmless fun, but deep down their intention was mockery. They wanted to see what would happen if a lonely man and a woman with a painful label were pushed together. To them, it was entertainment. Mara did not know any of this. She was simply told that a man named Elias Ward would accept her into his home. She traveled with a small bag and a heart full of fear. She expected to be rejected as soon as she arrived because that was what she had grown used to. She wondered if this new place would be any different from the others. The road to the ranch felt longer than her entire life. Every step reminded her of the heavy word placed on her by people who had never understood her struggle. Elias was repairing a fence. When he saw a figure walking along the dusty road, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and narrowed his eyes. Visitors were rare. When the woman finally reached him, she kept her head low, unsure of what to say. Elias stood quietly, not wanting to frighten her. He noticed her trembling hands, the way she held her small bag like it was the only thing she owned, and how her shoulders curved inward as if she wanted to disappear. "I was told to come here," Mara whispered softly. "They said you needed someone to help." Elias didn't understand at first. He wasn't expecting anyone, but something about her voice made him pause. It carried not arrogance, not demand, but pain. He nodded slowly and opened the gate, guiding her inside. He didn't question her or ask why she was sent. He simply accepted her presence the way he accepted rain or sunshine, quietly and without judgment. The inside of the house was simple but warm. Elias moved aside so she could enter. She expected him to stare or ask uncomfortable questions, but he remained respectful and calm. He set a glass of water on the table and gestured for her to sit. Mara lowered herself onto the chair, feeling unsure if she deserved even this small comfort. She watched Elias move slowly, with steady hands, as if he didn't want to frighten her. "You can stay here tonight," he said gently. "You look tired." The words were simple, but to Mara, they felt like a lifeline. She nodded, afraid her voice would crack if she spoke. Elias prepared a small meal bread, warm stew, and tea. He placed the food in front of her and stepped back to give her space. Mara took slow bites, feeling the warmth spread through her. It had been a long time since she had eaten a meal made with care. After a while, Elias asked softly, "Do you want to tell me why you came?" Mara looked at her hands. "They said you would take me in," she whispered. "They said you were alone." Elias nodded once. "That part is true." She hesitated before speaking again. "They also said it didn't matter who they sent. They said I wouldn't be wanted anywhere else." Her voice broke. Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not anger at her, but at the cruelty she had endured. He didn't know all the details, but he could see the truth in her trembling shoulders. He leaned slightly forward. "I don't know what they said to you," he replied softly, "but you're safe here." Mara blinked several times as if the words didn't make sense. No one had said she was safe in a long time. People had always treated her like a burden or a mistake. Elias, with his calm eyes and steady voice, was the first person who didn't look at her with judgment. She was given a small room at the back of the house. The bed was simple, but soft, and someone had placed a handmade quilt on top. Mara ran her fingers across the fabric, wondering what she had done to deserve kindness. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch, the wind, the horses, and Elias moving about the house with careful steps. She realized he was trying not to disturb her. Later that night, as she stood by the small window, she saw Elias outside, checking the horses and locking the gates. His movements were gentle, his posture steady. He didn't seem bothered by her presence. He didn't treat her like a chore. He simply accepted that she was there. For Mara, this calm acceptance felt like a new world. When she lay down to sleep, she expected nightmares or old memories to haunt her. But the silence of the ranch provided something she had never known: peace. She slept deeply, without fear, for the first time in many years. Elias stayed awake longer than usual. He kept thinking about the woman who had arrived without warning. He wondered who had sent her, and why she carried such sorrow. He didn't know her story, but he knew she needed rest and safety. That was enough for him. He decided he would not let the cruelty of others harm her again. Morning arrived with soft light touching the fields. Mara stepped out of her room carefully, as if afraid she might break the calm. Elias was already awake, preparing breakfast. He greeted her with a quiet nod, and she responded with a small, shy smile. They ate together without many words, but the silence felt comfortable, not cold. Mara offered to help with chores, but Elias shook his head gently. "You don't have to work today," he said. "Just settle in." But Mara insisted on helping. She followed him to the barn, watching how he interacted with the horses. She admired his patience, how he spoke softly to the animals, how he fixed things with steady, careful hands. Elias showed her how to feed the horses, how to carry water, and how to move safely around them. Mara learned quickly, grateful for something to do. Each task made her feel less like a burden. By midday, the fear she had carried for so long began to loosen. She still didn't understand why Elias was so kind, but she felt the weight on her chest slowly lifting. She caught him glancing at her once, not with judgment, but with concern. It made her feel seen, not exposed. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sky turn orange, Mara finally spoke. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything. I didn't expect kindness." Elias looked at her, his eyes steady and honest. "Everyone deserves kindness," he replied. Mara lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by such simple truth. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing clearly: this quiet ranch and this quiet man had given her something she thought she would never have again: hope. And for Elias, the moment he saw her smile, even for a second, he realized his life had changed the moment she walked through his gate. Mara woke the next morning with a sense of calm she had not felt in many years. The room was warm, the quilt soft, and the light coming through the window gentle. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered Elias's quiet kindness from the previous day, and her heart settled. She stood up slowly, brushed her hair with her fingers, and stepped outside her room. The soft smell of warm bread drifted through the small house. She heard Elias moving around the kitchen, his boots tapping lightly on the wooden floor. When Elias saw her, he gave a small nod, the same quiet greeting he always offered. He slid a plate of food toward her: bread, a bit of honey, and warm milk. Mara thanked him in a soft voice. She still spoke carefully, unsure if she was welcome to speak freely or if she was taking up too much space. But Elias never looked impatient or annoyed. He ate calmly, letting her take her time. After breakfast, Mara insisted on helping with chores again. She felt it was the least she could do. Elias tried to tell her she didn't have to, but she gently shook her head and followed him outside. The morning air was cool and fresh, and the ranch looked peaceful under the rising sun. Birds sang from the trees, and the horses grazed quietly behind the fence. Elias handed Mara a small bucket. "If you want to help," he said softly, "you can refill the water troughs. But don't carry too much at once." Mara nodded, grateful that he trusted her enough to let her work. She carried small buckets of water to the horses, and Elias watched from a distance to make sure she didn't push herself too hard. She was careful with every step, wanting to prove she could be useful. As the morning passed, she felt lighter. The ranch work gave her something to focus on, something to feel proud of. She had never been allowed to contribute much in her old life, always told she wasn't enough, always reminded of what she couldn't do. But here Elias never spoke those words. He simply showed her how things worked and let her learn at her own pace. Around midday, Mara rested under the shade of a large tree near the barn. Elias brought her a cup of cool water and sat a few feet away, leaving space between them so she would not feel uncomfortable. Mara thanked him again, and he nodded quietly. "You work hard," Elias said in his calm voice. "You don't have to do everything in one day." Mara looked down at her hands, feeling shy. "I want to help," she replied softly. "It makes me feel useful." Elias didn't push for more answers. He simply nodded again, understanding without needing many words. As the day went on, Mara noticed how Elias treated every living thing with patience. He never raised his voice at the horses, never threw tools when something went wrong, never blamed anyone for mistakes. She found comfort in the way he worked, steady, gentle, always thinking before acting. It made her feel safer than she had felt in years. Gradually, she started talking more. At first, small sentences, then small stories. She told him about her childhood, how she used to sit by the river near her old home collecting smooth stones. She told him about the people who had called her names, about the hurtful whispers that followed her everywhere. Elias listened carefully, his hands still, but his eyes full of quiet understanding. One evening, as they finished feeding the horses, Mara finally spoke about the word she feared the most, the word that had shaped her life. "They called me infertile," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "They said I would never be able to have a family. And because of that, people treated me like I was broken." She swallowed hard, expecting judgment from Elias. But when she looked up at him, his expression had not changed. He did not ask if it was true or if she had proof. He simply looked at her with steady eyes and said, "You are not broken." The words were simple, but they shook her deeply. No one had ever said them before. No one had ever rejected the cruel label. Mara felt tears gather in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed to show such emotion. Elias pretended not to notice, giving her dignity in her moment of pain. Days turned into weeks. Mara learned new things on the ranch every day. She learned to guide the horses gently, to gather eggs without startling the chickens, to help Elias repair small parts of the fence. She even learned to cook a few dishes that Elias enjoyed, surprising him with a warm meal one evening when he returned tired from fixing a broken gate far out on the land. He thanked her quietly, but Mara saw the light in his eyes. Their routine became steady. They woke early, shared breakfast, worked side by side, and ended the evenings watching the sky change colors. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they stayed silent. But the silence was comfortable, a shared peace, not an empty space. Mara's spirit began to heal, little by little. She smiled more, spoke more, and even laughed once while watching a stubborn horse refuse to move because it wanted an apple. Elias glanced at her, surprised by the sound. It had been a long time since laughter filled his ranch. He found himself smiling too, even though he wasn't sure she saw it. One afternoon, a group of townsfolk rode past the ranch. They saw Mara working near the barn and smirked among themselves. They hadn't forgotten the joke they had played. They expected to see her struggling or being sent away. But instead, they saw her carrying feed with confidence, saw Elias working beside her, treating her as an equal. Their expressions shifted. Some felt guilty, some confused. They had not expected the outcome to be peace. They had hoped, or maybe assumed, that misery would grow from their cruel joke. But it hadn't. Mara noticed them watching and instinctively stepped closer to the barn, as if wanting to hide. Elias stood near her, silently letting her know she wasn't alone. The townsfolk eventually moved on, leaving dust in the air behind them. Mara let out a small breath of relief. "You don't have to be afraid of them," Elias said gently. Mara shook her head. "It's not fear, I just don't want them to laugh again." Elias didn't ask what they had laughed at in the past. He already knew enough to understand her heart was tired of being a target. "They won't laugh here," he said simply. That evening, Mara felt grateful in a way she couldn't express. While preparing dinner, she wanted to tell Elias how much his patience meant to her, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, she placed an extra piece of warm bread on his plate and hoped he would understand her silent gratitude. Another week passed, and Mara grew stronger each day. Her eyes held more light, her shoulders were less tense, and her steps more confident. She began to enjoy helping with the horses the most. They were sensitive animals, quick to sense emotions, and they responded to her gentle nature. Elias watched her grow in comfort and skill, and he felt a quiet pride he rarely felt for anyone but himself. One night, a big storm swept across the valley. The wind roared outside, and rain hit the windows like stones. Mara sat near the fireplace, hugging her knees, remembering how storms used to frighten her. Elias brought a blanket and placed it over her shoulders without saying anything. She looked up at him, her eyes soft, and nodded in appreciation. He sat nearby, keeping her company as the storm raged on. In that quiet moment, Mara realized something important. She had been sent to Elias as a joke, but this place no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a home. A place where she could breathe, move, heal, and be seen with respect. She understood that kindness didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a quiet cowboy who listened without interrupting, who worked without boasting, and who offered warmth without expecting anything in return. When the storm finally calmed, Mara whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." Elias met her eyes for a long moment before replying, "You don't have to thank me. You belong here as much as I do." Mara felt her heart swell. No one had ever told her she belonged anywhere. She held on to those words, letting them settle deep inside her. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew the ranch had become a place she didn't want to leave. And for Elias, watching Mara find strength again brought a quiet joy he didn't fully understand yet. He had lived alone for years, but now, with Mara there, the house felt warmer, the days felt fuller, and the quiet felt shared instead of empty. Little did either of them know, life was preparing to surprise them in a way that would change everything forever. The days passed gently on the ranch, and Mara slowly built a routine that felt natural, almost as if she had always belonged there. Her mornings were filled with the soft sounds of animals waking up, the smell of warm bread on the table, and the quiet presence of Elias moving with steady steps around the kitchen. She had grown comfortable in his company, and the silence shared between them now felt warm instead of awkward. Yet something strange had begun happening inside her, something she did not understand at first. It was small things. She felt tired more often, even after sleeping well. Her hand shook slightly when she carried the water buckets. She tried to ignore it, thinking maybe she wasn't eating enough or working too hard. But Elias watched her closely. He had grown used to seeing her strong, steady movements, and he sensed something unusual in the way her shoulders drooped and her eyes blinked slowly, like she was struggling to stay awake. One morning, while feeding the horses, Mara paused and put a hand on the fence to steady herself. The world spun for a moment. She nearly dropped the bucket. Elias reached her in a few steps and gently took the bucket from her hand. "You're not feeling well," he said quietly. Mara forced a small smile. "Just a little tired." Elias shook his head. "You don't look like yourself." She didn't want to worry him, so she insisted she could keep working. But by afternoon, she felt dizzy again. She sat down on a hay bale, her breathing uneven. Elias knelt beside her. "This isn't just tiredness," he said softly. "We need to get someone to look at you." Mara's heart raced. She hated the idea of being examined, of people asking questions. of being judged again. But Elias's calm voice eased her fear. He didn't sound angry or frustrated. He sounded concerned, genuinely concerned. "There's a traveling doctor coming through town today," Elias added. "We can ride in and see him. It won't take long." Mara hesitated, but when she tried to stand, her legs felt weak. She finally nodded. Elias helped her onto the horse gently, making sure she was steady before climbing up himself. The ride to town was quiet. Mara leaned slightly against him, not out of choice, but because she felt too faint to sit straight. Elias kept one arm around her back, steadying her without making her feel uncomfortable. When they reached the town, some people stared. A few whispered quietly, surprised to see Mara with Elias, surprised to see her looking pale and unwell. But Elias ignored them. He walked with purpose toward the doctor's wagon, helping Mara sit on a small wooden stool while the doctor prepared his tools. The doctor, an older man with kind eyes, asked Mara a few gentle questions. He checked her pulse, felt her temperature, and studied her face for a moment. Then he smiled in a way that made her heart race with confusion. "Congratulations," he said lightly. "You're expecting." Mara blinked, unsure if she heard correctly. "Expecting?" She whispered. The doctor chuckled softly. "A baby. You're going to be a mother." The words struck her like a wave. She stared at the doctor, her eyes wide, her lips parting in disbelief. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. She had been told all her life that she would never have a child, that her body was incapable, that hope was foolish. She had accepted it long ago, even though it had broken her heart in places no one could see now. Suddenly, a stranger was telling her something completely different, something impossible. I can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling. I was told it wasn't possible." The doctor shook his head gently. "Sometimes people are wrong. Sometimes life surprises us." Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't know if they were from joy, fear, or pure confusion. She looked at Elias, who had been standing quietly in the corner. His eyes were calm, steady, and full of something she couldn't name, something like wonder mixed with disbelief. Elias moved closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. Not to claim her, not to take credit, but to give support. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. Mara covered her mouth with both hands as tears finally fell. She wasn't crying from sadness. She wasn't crying from pain. She was crying because the heavy weight she had carried for years, the belief that she was broken, had been lifted in one moment. When they stepped out of the doctor's wagon, the news spread quickly through the town. People whispered again, but this time their whispers were not mocking. They were shocked. They were confused. Some felt guilty because they had been the same people who sent her to Elias as a cruel joke. They had wanted to see her fail, not rise. But life had given her something they never expected. Elias guided Mara back to the horse, helping her mount carefully. He rode slowly, making sure she was comfortable the whole way home. Mara remained silent, her mind whirling with thoughts she couldn't control. She kept one hand on her belly, still trying to understand that something precious was growing inside her. Elias didn't try to talk. He let her think, knowing she needed time to accept the news. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down gently. She walked inside and sat on the bed, feeling the quilt under her hands. Everything looked the same as before, yet everything felt different. Elias stood in the doorway, unsure if she wanted company or space. Mara looked up at him, her eyes still shining with emotion. She gestured for him to sit beside her. He did, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. After a long silence, Mara finally spoke. "I don't understand," she said softly. "All my life, they said I couldn't have children. They said I was worthless because of it. And now," Elias looked at her gently, "now life has shown something different. But why?" she whispered. "Why now?" Elias didn't offer a complicated answer. He simply replied, "Because you deserve good things." Mara lowered her gaze, overwhelmed. She had never been told she deserved anything good. She had never imagined she would hear those words from anyone, especially someone like Elias, steady, kind, and sincere. In the following days, Mara moved carefully around the ranch. She didn't want to push herself too hard, and Elias didn't let her. He took over most of the heavy work, lifting buckets, fixing fences, feeding the horses. He insisted she rest, at least for now. Mara felt guilty at first, watching him work alone. But he always shook his head when she tried to help. "You need to take it slow," he told her. "It's important." She listened, not because she felt weak, but because his concern warmed her heart more than she expected. She spent more time inside the house, sewing small cloths and cooking simple meals. She even started humming while she worked, surprising herself with the sound. It had been years since she hummed anything. The townsfolk grew curious. A few of them visited the ranch pretending they were checking on Elias, but their eyes always searched for Mara. Some of them apologized quietly, others asked uncomfortable questions. Mara stayed polite but distant. She wasn't ready to face the people who had laughed at her pain. Elias stood between her and anyone who tried to get too close, his calm presence enough to remind them to stay respectful. One evening, as Mara sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elias stepped out and sat beside her. They didn't speak. They simply watched the sky turn gold and pink, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch settling for the night. After a while, Mara whispered, "I'm scared." Elias turned to her. "Of what?" "Of losing this," she said. "Of losing the baby. Of losing everything." Elias shook his head. "You're not alone," he replied. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Mara looked at him, her heart full. She wasn't sure when it happened, but she had come to trust him deeply, more than she ever trusted anyone before. She felt safe with him, protected, understood. She placed a hand on her belly again. A new life was growing inside her, a life she had never expected to have. And the quiet cowboy beside her made her believe that maybe, just maybe, this miracle wasn't a mistake. It was a beginning. Mira's pregnancy slowly changed the rhythm of life on the ranch. What had once been quiet, steady days now carried a deeper meaning. Elias woke earlier, checked the fences more often, and made sure the horses were calm so the ranch stayed safe and peaceful for her. He watched Mara carefully, not in a controlling way, but in a protective one, making sure she never lifted anything too heavy or pushed herself more than she should. Mara, in return, learned to trust his judgment, something she had never done with anyone before. The weeks passed gently, and the ranch seemed to settle into a new kind of warmth. Mara's steps became slower, her face softer, and her smile more real. She often sat on the porch wrapped in a light blanket, her hands resting on her stomach, watching Elias work in the fields. Sometimes she waved at him, and he'd nod back with a small smile that said more than words could. She spent her afternoons sewing tiny clothes, simple little shirts and soft cloths. She had never made anything like them before, and each small piece felt like a promise. While she worked, she thought about the life inside her, a life she never believed she would have. Each stitch was filled with hope, something she had not dared to feel for a very long time. Some days, Elias would come in from the fields and find her asleep on the couch, her hand still holding a piece of cloth and a needle. He would gently place the sewing aside, cover her with a blanket, and sit nearby for a moment just to make sure she was resting peacefully. Then he would go back to his chores without waking her. He didn't tell her he did these small things. He didn't do them for praise. He did them because her peace mattered to him. The townsfolk slowly but surely realized that the cruel joke they had played months ago had led to something they did not expect. The woman they mocked now carried a miracle. Some of them felt ashamed, remembering the day they sent her away with laughter. They began approaching the ranch, offering small gifts, fresh vegetables, blankets, herbs for tea, or simply quiet apologies. Mara accepted their kindness politely, but stayed distant. She wasn't angry anymore. She simply didn't want to let their past words harm her again. Elias stood by her side whenever visitors came. He never raised his voice, never argued, but his calm presence alone made people choose their words carefully. They had never seen him protective before, and it surprised them. But those who looked closely understood why. Mara wasn't just someone staying at his ranch. She had become a part of his life in a way neither of them had planned. As the months continued, Mara's belly grew round and full. She began to walk with slow steps, one hand always resting on her side. She got tired easily and often sat near the fireplace with a warm drink. Elias made sure to keep her comfortable. He fixed a softer chair for her. He placed extra cushions near the bed. He even built a small footstool so she could rest her feet. Mara appreciated every small gesture, and each one filled her heart with warmth. Sometimes, at night, she would speak softly to the baby, telling stories about the ranch, about the horses, about the quiet man who always watched over them. Elias would hear her voice from the hallway, pause, and smile to himself before walking away quietly. He never interrupted her moments with the unborn child. He knew they were precious. One cold evening, as they sat by the fire, Mara looked down at her stomach and whispered, "I still can't believe this is real." Elias turned his head toward her. "It's as real as the sun that rises every day," he said gently. She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Do you ever wonder why things happen this way?" Elias nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "but not in a bad way. Life brings what it brings. We just do our best with it." Mara smiled at that. She liked how Elias saw the world, not through doubt or fear, but through steady acceptance. It made her feel safe, even when she didn't fully understand the future. When winter came, the ranch grew cold and quiet. Snow covered the fields like a soft blanket, and the horses snorted warm air into the frosty wind. Elias brought in extra firewood every morning. He kept the house warm at all hours, making sure Mara never felt chilled. She had trouble sleeping at night due to discomfort, so he checked on her often, bringing warm tea or helping her move the pillows until she was comfortable again. One night, Mara woke Elias with a soft cry. She wasn't scared, just overwhelmed. She whispered, "Elias, the baby is moving." He rushed to her side instantly, his eyes wide with surprise. Mara took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. After a moment, he felt it a tiny flutter, a small but clear movement. Elias froze, his breath catching. He had never felt anything like it before. He looked at Mara with an expression she had never seen on him, pure. "Ah, he's real," Elias whispered. Mara nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, he's very real." As the due date approached, Elias prepared everything he could. He cleaned the house thoroughly, fixed the roof so no rain would get in, and even planted new grass near the porch so the front of the house would look fresh and welcoming. The traveling doctor came by twice to check on Mara, assuring them both that everything was going well. Finally, one early morning, as the sky was still dark and the stars faint, Mara felt her first strong pain. She grabbed the edge of the table and called for Elias. He rushed to her side immediately, steadying her with a firm but gentle grip. The doctor was sent for right away, and within an hour, the small house was filled with quiet, urgent sounds. Mara breathing through pain, the doctor giving instructions, Elias supporting her hand the whole time. The hours felt long, but Mara stayed strong. Guided by the steady presence of the man who had given her the first safe home she'd ever known, he never left her side, not even for a moment. When she felt scared, he looked into her eyes and said softly, "You can do this. I'm right here." And those simple words gave her more strength than she knew she had. At last, as the sun began to rise and light spread through the window, a tiny cry filled the room. The doctor lifted the newborn boy, wrapped him in a soft cloth, and placed him gently in Mara's arms. She stared at the baby, her breath trembling, her heart full. The child was small, warm, and perfect. Tears fell down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. Elias stood beside her, his hand shaking slightly. He had never felt such overwhelming emotion. Mara looked up at him and whispered, "He's a miracle." Elias nodded slowly. "Yes," he said softly. "He truly is." When Mara held the baby close, she felt the weight of all the years when people told her she was worthless, broken, unable to give life. Those voices faded completely. She wasn't broken. She wasn't empty. She wasn't what they said she was. She was a mother. The news spread through town again. People who once mocked her now spoke of her with amazement. The miracle baby became a symbol of hope, a reminder that life didn't always follow the cruel words of others. Some people came to see the child, leaving small gifts by the door. Others simply stayed quiet. knowing they had no right to speak after the way they had treated her. But Mara didn't think about them anymore. Her focus was on her child, and on the quiet man who had become her anchor in a world that once pushed her aside. Elias and Mara stood together on the porch one evening, the baby sleeping in her arms. The sky was painted with warm colors of sunset. Elias looked at Mara, then at the child. Feeling something deep in his chest, something like peace, something like love, something like belonging. Mara rested her head lightly against his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a home." Elias shook his head gently. "You gave this place life," he said. "You both did." As the sun dipped behind the hills, the little family stood quietly, wrapped in the calm of the evening. The ranch no longer felt like a place for one lonely soul. It had become a home filled with warmth, hope, and new beginnings. A cruel joke had brought Mara there, but a miracle had allowed her to stay. And now, the ranch held a future brighter than either of them had ever imagined.